If you've watched my series on the War in Heaven, it's highly likely you've been left with a lot more questions than answers by the end of it, unless you're one of those cannon welders. And that's okay, but the truth is there aren't many answers, and where there are answers, they aren't definitive. They aren't entirely true. If you haven't watched my series, then I still think you might get some value out of the video. I mean, you clicked on it, right? It must have taken your interest in some way, and that's good. The War in Heaven, the enemy, by their very natures as from a forgotten medium, means they have significantly less agency and placement in the Doctor Who continuity. These books were intended to be the main story after the show ended, so when the show came back, they faded into obscurity, only being known by the most invested of Doctor Who fans. Licensing agreements mean that nothing on TV can rely on separate material from an extended universe. Audiences should be able to understand TV content on its own, though even if this didn't exist and viewers had to read the EDAs, would they even understand that content by itself? I'll talk about this more later. So let's discuss the War in Heaven, the theories around it and where it fits into continuity, and of course discuss the enemy, what it is, or could be. As for the war's relationship with the last Great Time War, accounts of in-universe adventures give contradictory tales. Some accounts suggested the wars were, to some degree, synonymous, with Straxus becoming involved in rising tensions before the last Great Time War and being involved in the War in Heaven. Some accounts of the Time War referred to it simply as the War, and acknowledged the existence of multiple Gallifreys, which lined up with the official name of the War in Heaven, being the War, and the Nine Gallifreys Project. Carville, a Time Lord defeated during the Time War, became leader of the Clock People, who themselves were survivors of the War in Heaven. The Greth also referred to the conflict that the Clock People had been involved in as a Great War, a term used by the Daleks to describe their war with Gallifrey. Additionally, the Etra Prime incident, viewed as an early conflict in what would become the Time War, was discussed on Gallifrey at the onset of the War in Heaven as one of its warning signs. The 10th Doctor, thinking back to the destruction of Gallifrey at the end of the Time War, remembered the events of the 8th Doctor's destruction of Gallifrey to stop the War in Heaven. The novel, Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, was renamed Doctor Question Mark in an Exciting Adventure with the Enemy to hide the proper names of the subjects. However, the Time Lord homunculette was certain that the enemy and the Daleks were distinct, believing that the Daleks were nothing compared to the threat that his people were facing. According to some Time Lord briefings, a species of xenophobic mutants travelling in their own personal war machines were trying to take advantage of the war for their own means, to the point that some people with a flawed understanding of the war wrongly believed the Daleks to be the enemy. Nonetheless, some historical texts held that the Daleks were the mysterious enemy that Gallifrey had long prophesied would emerge to destroy them. The Squire later proclaimed the Daleks to have been the great enemy of the Time Lords. Direct encounters with the enemy were classed as Omega-level events, and the Dalek conquest of Arcadia during the Time War was classified as deserving a priority Omega warning code. The player also directly referred to the Daleks and the Time War as the enemy and the war respectively during his encounter with the First Doctor to keep details secretive. The Daleks had also definitely been the enemy in a parallel universe version of the War in Heaven created by the Quantum Archangel. In this version of the conflict, the Sixth Doctor led the Time Lords to abandon their non-interference policy to begin the war, only for the Master to later side with the Daleks to help them secure an advantage. Eventually, the fighting forced the Doctor to destroy the universe with a superweapon. Due to the BBC's merchandising regulations, The Last Great Time War shown on TV and The War in Heaven cannot be regarded as the same conflict. In other media, such as Big Finish, it can be less ambiguous. On TV, every BBC drama must be self-contained in a continuity that doesn't rely on a viewer buying other content. Everything must be understandable to a casual viewer, seeing the episodes separate to obscure novels. Let's put it this way. It's likely that around 4,000 to 9,000 copies of the Ancestor cell exist, whereas 12.8 million people watched The Day of the Doctor, and 10.81 watched Rose, so when the Ninth Doctor is talking about there being a war, less than 10,000 people would know what he's talking about if he meant the War in Heaven. Other accounts gave hints that the Last Great Time War could be a part of the War in Heaven, or vice versa. In the lead-up, Chris Quedge negotiated an alliance between the Time Lords and the Daleks, because the gods of Dela were a common enemy of both. The Daleks agreed to play the part of the enemy in several microscopic models of the war with far less scope and intensity. The only Gallifrey to survive one of these wars did so by abandoning looms and returning to organic models of birth, allowing it to enact the victimhood ritual of an entrenched last stand by crying out to the future, matching the circumstances on the last day of the last Great Time War. Alternatively, there was a period of the last Great Time War where the Daleks were wiped out from existence by the War Valiard. Until the Daleks were restored by the Dalek Time Strategist and a copy of Davros, the Time Lords were unable to exactly recall who they had been fighting, leaving them to ponder who their mysterious, unknowable enemy had been. Not even the countless slaves the Daleks had conscripted to serve as disposable troops could remember whom they'd been serving. Now, to me, this is more likely than them being the same conflict. The Time War just being a small piece of the magnificence of the War in Heaven feels plausible. It's quite clear that the enemy and the Daleks are on two starkly different power levels. As for it being a result of the War Valiard's actions while the Time Strategist restored history, this is significantly weaker of a theory, and only brings up more questions than it answers. During the faction Paradox invasion of Gallifrey, the Eighth Doctor elected to destroy Romana III's Gallifrey, seemingly ending the conflict by essentially aborting the timeline occurred in at the cost of Gallifrey, although some accounts did imply the planet he destroyed was not the original Gallifrey, which would make his actions for nothing if true. Nonetheless, the Eighth Doctor did find himself in the post-war universe after these actions. Additionally, earlier in Gallifreyan history, Irving Braxiatel went on a mission to cancel out the existence of Romana III, albeit a Romana III who seemed different from the one involved in the War in Heaven. According to Brax, he did this on her orders to avert a war that devastated Gallifrey, but he did not go into detail about what that conflict exactly entailed. Nonetheless, Brax's actions seemed to ensure Gallifrey would not know a new, full-scale war until the Time War. His actions also ensured that Omega never escaped his antimatter universe, which he had in a perverted state of reality that in some way came before the War in Heaven. This to me is the most likely true series of events. The War in Heaven was aborted by the Eighth Doctor, and everything that continues to be produced about the events in it are like tree branches growing outwards. Let's think of it this way, with a handy image I found on Google. The EDAs and the Book of the War are the roots of the tree, events that cannot change and don't need to. They're the primary foundation of the war, and if anything, a shorter summary of the key events within it. The Faction Paradox main series, and anything further produced by Mad Norwegian Press, Obverse Books, are continuing further up the tree, the trunk, expanding on events spoken on in the roots. Then everything further outside of that, whatever Bill Baggs is cooking up nowadays that is absolutely unhinged, and the stuff from Arcbeetle are the branches. They don't really have much relevance on the main story because they can't legally, so they're exploring other, and in Arcbeetle's case, more interesting avenues of the war. They're doing their own thing that is almost unrecognisable from the roots, but it is still part of the war. All of these branches take place in a timeline that no longer exists. It did exist, it had ramifications, but it no longer matters to the central story. Yet other accounts, however, go on even further, implying that Gallifrey somehow returned from its destruction in the War in Heaven, allowing the last Great Time War to occur after this apparent Time Lord victory in the earlier Time War. By some accounts, Chris Quedge's superiors, the Time Lords, seemingly survived beyond the war through the V-Time experiment. They referred to the war as W-Time, using the letter's shape to illustrate its cosmic symmetry, in contrast with their new enemy-free reality, V-Time. Before Gallifrey's possible future restoration, the War in Heaven resulted in the Time Lords being nearly wiped from history, save for the 4 surviving elementals. So, although the Daleks had been seen as far less dangerous than the enemy during the war itself, they began growing in universal prominence in the post-war universe, taking advantage of how the Time Lords were no longer present to quell the advance in time-travel development in the lesser species. Indeed, the War Doctor reflected that the Daleks and the Time Lords were on equal footing when it came to time travel power during their Time War, with the wider Time Lord military even fearing Dalek technology was more advanced than their own equipment. The Tomorrow Windows had given the Eighth Doctor a glimpse of a future in which the Time Lords were restored after the War in Heaven, but they also warned him of the Daleks, showing grey drones and a saucer sweeping over a ruined city. Baron Amitsumara once claimed that the true war would begin when the War in Heaven ended, and the powerful Great Black Eye that watched over the post-war universe, waiting for a chance to strike, may have been the eye stalk of a Dalek. The rogue house of faction Paradox could have potentially lived on in the Clock People, the group Carville came to lead after his involvement in the Time War. However, the 13th Doctor believed that the faction had left the universe far behind sometime before the Time War began. While siblings Same and Different were known to have taken part in the conflict, the Doctor rationalised that they could have been part of the fraction of the faction that elected to remain in the universe, with the Doctor even pondering whether more of this possible remnant were active in the universe long after the war with the Daleks had ended. This for me is a continuation of the Aborted Timeline, and that seems to line up as the true history. Big Finish have certainly taken this attitude, as though many early 2000s stories certainly reference the EDAs and vice versa. Later on, nothing is referenced at all. The Time War is the definitive end of the 8th Doctor. How this welds with the post-war events, I cannot connect however much I try. So what do I think is the case? What's my theory to string all of this together? Well, the War in Heaven did happen, but to me it was aborted by the 8th Doctor. Everything still happened within it, but was retroactively erased by the destruction of Romana III's Gallifrey. It still did happen, and still could be accessed, as shown by Compassion entering it in her personal future, but she is a very unique character. I like the idea that the moment, or the greater key, or simply the weapon, has been rewriting history over and over again until a favourable outcome was reached. The enemy is too powerful to fight, and Gallifrey is gone? Well, now they're the Daleks, and the 8th Doctor sacrificed both Gallifrey and the Daleks. How do we fix this? We get a new incarnation. It's the 9th Doctor from the early drafts of Day of the Doctor. Still hasn't worked? Well, now we have another incarnation dedicated to the war, and Gallifrey is alive. But so are the Daleks in a much more weakened state. It has created the only timeline where the Time Lords survive, and the Doctor doesn't have to destroy them to save the universe. The only timeline where he doesn't actually use the weapon. Of course, the Daleks do survive as well, but in an incredibly weakened state, created by Davros, who doesn't even know the innovations of the late war. Any Time War era Daleks have been destroyed by the 11th Doctor's time, so all that technology is just gone. Something that also needs to be addressed is the name changing. Why everything sounds so different? Why are the Time Lords suddenly the Great Houses, or the Superiors, or the Sun Builders? Well, perhaps the most widely recognised theory is that the words became weapons, and so had to be changed so they weren't accidentally activated. Of course, the real reason is licensing issues, but that's not too exciting, is it? As for the enemy, they are interesting, to say the least. I will straight up say we do not know the enemy's identity for sure, if they even have an identity. And that's the point. You're not supposed to put a face to the name. Not all things are meant to be definitively explained. Lawrence Miles once said that he knew who the enemy was by the end of Alien Bodies. He had a good idea of it, and one of his plans for if he'd written a final book on the War in Heaven was to reveal the enemy's identity. He had 8 ideas for it. So he said to Stephen Cole, is it possible for us to print 8 different versions of the book where the last page is changed depending on the identity of the enemy, so that there wouldn't be a definitive one? Stephen Cole rightly said, this is not a good idea, we might as well just leave it a mystery, and left a mystery it was. Kind of. We'll get into that. But we do have a list of possible identities, aspects of the enemy given form, and agents aplenty. The enemy was potentially the gods of the Ainu. In the Book of the War, there are references to a seemingly deleted entry on the gods. Who else would want such information redacted? The Celestis, when they were the CIA, also described the future enemy as just as divine as the Time Lords themselves. Perhaps they were the Gods of Sphinxes, creating their own Sphinx space that none returned from alive. As we know, at the beginning of the war, the Lord President returned from the enemy as a severed head, with a note simply saying, "We are not amused," confirming the enemy as being a plural entity, and drawing a link between them and the gods. Perhaps these gods were the equivalent to the Time Lords in their universe, fighting to overtake another. It's potentially the case. When the enemy showed itself to the 8th Doctor, it was parodying Time Lord regalia. Maybe that was not only to mock its own enemy, but to show its status. Or maybe the enemy were a type of posthuman. It's widely believed that they originated from Earth, so the Ashlar shock troops they employed during the event could have been them in person from the beginning. Some accounts also suggested that Lolita was grooming humanity to become a threat to the Time Lords. The Ghost Point occurred right before humanity could have found new ways to think, to become unpredictable to the Time Lords. They did try and destroy Earth with anathema. It makes little sense why they would be wrong. Continuing on from this notion of an earthly enemy is the idea that they were in fact the 8 legs of Metebelis 3, as they did originate from Earth as spiders. The species planned for universal domination if the Third Doctor didn't intervene, and for a time, thanks to the blunder of faction paradox, he didn't. This great historical change could have led to them weaving a new web of time, one that would eventually rival the Time Lords themselves. During the war, therapy filters were applied to wartime agents recovering from Omega-level events, and these filters would delete terminology relating to spiders. Keeping on the same page of the enemy being a creature, Cernunnos, leader of the original Mammoths, could have been the leader of the enemy. He was certainly planning to undo the anchoring of the thread in a war against the Time Lords. Perhaps he ended up doing just that. Alas, we have no further information on him, as the Faction Paradox comics were discontinued before his story, and Hunt by George III was complete. Maybe they were the Time Lords themselves, who predicted the war would come and so wanted to prove themselves right, or were Time Lords from the future fighting against their past. Of course, one theory is that the Doctor is the enemy. He certainly isn't the most friendly with his race, but would he go far enough? He even said himself that depending on where you're standing, he was one of the enemy. He ended the war by erasing Gallifrey. Does that count? When Rassilon realised the true identity of the enemy, he asked for the Doctor's assassination, so even if he isn't the enemy itself, he certainly played a part in its existence. Perhaps one of the most interesting theories is that the enemy were the Paladin Horde from the 49th century. Originally in the early drafts of An Unearthly Child, why the Doctor and Susan were on the run, placing the enemy as one of the earliest pieces of the show's history, like the TARDIS and the Doctor himself. What about some boring options? The glaring elephant in the room, sorry Cernunnos, is the Daleks. They're the enemy in the Time War, so what about the enemy here? In the unfinished novel Enemy of the Daleks by Lance Parkin, they saw the future war and thought, that's gotta be us. But as soon as they tried to enter it, they were destroyed by the real enemy. Of course, this never came to be, but it's an interesting theory. In the Quantum Archangels timeline, they were the enemy, though this was only said through vague references to an old foe of the Doctor. This is the most boring, really. There's no way with a war such as this the Daleks were able to be players. At several points in their history, even far into the war, they never stood a chance. They probably just used the war for their own ends as a minor power, like Faction Paradox or the Sontarans. Or their ancestor cells. Perhaps the most boring of options. So what do I think? What is the enemy? Well, that leads us to the last theory. The enemy is metafiction. What is the most powerful thing you can think of that you can reasonably fight as a Time Lord? Fiction itself? I think the most interesting and coolest encounter with the enemy is when a Time Lord agent looked up at the sky and read backwards words in the air, before gazing at an aspect of the enemy as reality flickered to the left, as if the enemy were reading a book containing the agent. That's right, we are the enemy. The writers of Faction Paradox are the enemy. It can shape stories, rewrite reality around it, turn Sherlock Holmes into nothing but a fairy tale. But I'd like to go further. There is no one singular enemy. There never was or will be. The enemy is a collection of races who either think that they are the enemy or are working for the enemy, all to defeat the Time Lords. Whether they know of this truth or not, that depends on the race. The enemy can never be revealed because there is no enemy. It is an everything and nothing situation. This idea is exacerbated by the presence of the Friend, a group that defected from the enemy that had its own internal disagreements and political disputes. The enemy is a group, whether you look at it one way or another. And that's probably my final video on the War in Heaven. I can't really see myself doing many more in the future, but if you enjoyed then make sure to leave a like and subscribe down below if you haven't already. It really helps out the channel. My next video will be a retrospective on all of Time Lord Victorious, which if you can believe it was 5 years ago now, so if you want to be notified about that when it comes out, make sure you've got the little bell clicked. But as always, thanks for watching.